Hi, my name is Matthew Ventures, and I have worked on a solution for basically listening to the back button, which is a pretty common situation for apps that are on Android devices. So let me show you what that is. On my phone right here, I have an Android device, and this is what the back button looks like. So it's pretty much always there on the screen. You can always, no matter what app you're in, where you are using your phone, you could always push this back button. And if you are going to create an Android app, you probably want to have access to that back button, or at least the ability to subscribe to a call to that back button. So, for example, if you push this back button, I would exit the current app I'm in. Okay, so my solution is essentially a way to listen into the back button, to subscribe to it, and to override it if you want to. That way, if the back button is pushed, any other person who's listening to it can basically not be sent a message, and you can consume that message, like an override. Okay, so let's go into the demo. This asset bundle has 4 scripts and a scene which sort of has an example set up for you. So I'm going to walk through each of those really quickly and show you this demo in action. So if I play this game, I have these 3 different pop-ups set up here. So if I enable one of them, you're going to see that it has a close button. And this close button is just a normal button, but it has the back button script attached to it. And what the back button script does is it finds a sister component that's a button, and it subscribes a call to that button. So if you click that button, then it knows to send a message to the back button controller and inform anybody who's listening that a back button has been called. Okay, this is the listener pattern. So the back button script is pretty simple. It looks for a sister game object, that's a button. If it doesn't find one, it throws an error. And then if it does find one, which is what we assume, it will add a listener to its on-click event, and it will subscribe to a back button controller, which is a singleton. It will subscribe the back button pressed message. Or sorry, it won't subscribe, it will call the back button press message. So you'll also see that in this scene, I have the back button controller. So this is where most of the meat of this package or this feature will come from. And so if you look through this controller, I'll just briefly break down what's going on here. We have a singleton pattern. That way, each individual back button won't need a direct reference to this back button controller in order to call the back button function. Instead, it can reference its instance, as you saw in this example, right? It just goes back button controller.instance. That's what the singleton provides. So that's the singleton pattern. A number of patterns are coming into play here, right? The update is constantly listening for the input.getKeyDown escape, which on Android devices is what the back button is mapped to. It's also, if you're playing this on PC for demo, which I am, it's just the escape key on your keyboard. We now have the ability to override the back button, and we'll get to that in just a second. That's if you don't want a normal back button call and you want one pop-up, let's say, to be handled specifically first, no matter when it came up. So this override has some functionality within the code. The do override, if any, will choose to basically do that override rather than notifying all the listeners. And that's done down here in the handler. So if the back button is pressed, it will do the override, if any. And if the back button press was resolved, then it will not send the back button message to any listeners. So that's a lot of talk. Let's see this in action. I just set this pop-up to active. That was pop-up number 1. So you're going to see that pop-up 1 is subscribed to the on back button pressed. And that's done through the last script, which is, or second to last script, which is the pop-up. So if it's enabled, it will subscribe itself. That way it knows when a back button is pressed. And that method, back button pressed, is very simple. All it will do is consume the call. So basically tell the controller that, yes, this call was resolved. And it will also deactivate the game object. So if I push close, you'll see that the pop-up closed. So that button had no reference to the pop-up. All it did was send a message to the back button controller, which then independently sent a message to all the listeners, which was just one, the pop-up, who then knew to close. And that's really useful. That way you don't have to have basically a reference to the controller to the pop-up and a reference from the controller to every button. All you need to do to create a pop-up button is to add the back button script. So if I were to open up two pop-ups, let's clear our console there. You'll see, boom, I've subscribed from pop-up 1. Then boom, pop-up 2 has subscribed. So if I close one now, the listener will be caught by one of the two, and it's up to you if you, that's basically set up if it doesn't matter which one closes first. Then if I close, the listener will then send it to the other one. You can also set it up so that the pop-up call is not consumed. That way, it will broadcast the message to close all pop-ups, and one pop-up won't stop the message from propagating to future pop-ups. Finally, I realized in testing that it might be useful for a certain pop-up to close itself first, regardless of when it was opened. And that's the third pop-up I have in the scene called pop-up override. What that does is it's a little different. Instead of subscribing to when the pop-up is called, when it's enabled, it will override the back button. And in the override, it will basically say that if the back button is pressed, I want you to instead just disable this object. So quite simply, now if I close a different pop-up or that pop-up, no matter which one was created first, that 3 will always be the first one to go. Okay, because it's been override. So I'm gonna make 3, and then I'm gonna make 1. No matter when I press the close button, that third pop-up will always be the one to close because it's been overridden. So this, by the way, since it's mapped to the escape key, I could push the escape key on my keyboard, and that will also simulate a pop-up, just as it would if you were to push the back button in an Android device. So I use this code all the time on my game NSA Intern, and it's really useful for subscribing to pop-ups, especially when you might have a number of different things going on in a scene, and you want to just create a very simple back button. It's been really useful for me, so hopefully you find a purpose for it in your code. Thank you.